U.S. President Donald Trump has wrapped up his visit to China, with President Xi Jinping describing the trip as a milestone that established a new bilateral relationship. While both leaders were full of public praise for the summit, there were few concrete outcomes, and clear conflicts remain, especially over Taiwan. Trump said he has not made a decision on whether to move forward with a major U.S. arms package for Taiwan.
A rare tour of President Xi Jinping's official residence provided a tranquil backdrop for Donald Trump's last day in China. Walking through the ancient trees, Xi confirmed that Trump was among a small group of leaders to be invited in. There's been plenty of flattery between the leaders during the two-day summit.
Nice place. Nice place.
But few concrete outcomes. Discussions around trade and business deals resulted in limited announcements. And behind the praise, key conflicts remain, not least over Taiwan. Beijing claims the island as its own territory, and Xi had warned Trump that mishandling the issue could put the US and China in conflict. Trump had this update for reporters on his flight home from China.
On Taiwan, he does not want to see a fight for independence because that would be a very strong confrontation. And I heard him out. Are you going to change your word? No, I didn't make a comment on it. I heard him out. I have a lot of respect for him.
Trump had authorized an $11 billion arms package for Taiwan in December, but now says he's deciding whether to move forward with it. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on Thursday that it would be a, quote, terrible mistake for China to take Taiwan by force. But defending Taiwan could prove to be problematic for Washington if it wants meetings like these to end with more than just public pleasantries.
I spoke about this earlier with our correspondents Benjamin Alvarez Gruber in Washington and Rick Glauert in Taiwan. I began by asking Benjamin what President Trump has to show for his visit.
At least this image of harmony, there seems to be some damage control happening on the background, also on the sidelines of this meeting. Of course, this new invitation for Xi Jinping to come to the U.S. in September. But if we look at the posts that they sent out on several social media accounts, one of them, American Strength Back on the world stage, it's rather the optics than actually some concrete announcement when it comes to not only the war in Iran, but also some trade agreements and some commercial agreements that especially the U.S. delegation was waiting for during this summit in China.
Rick, for Taiwan, the stakes in all this couldn't be higher. It's heavily reliant on the U.S. militarily, economically, while China is becoming ever bolder in its efforts to bring Taiwan under its control. What do you make of Donald Trump's remarks on Taiwan following this visit?
Well, we heard some of the usual rhetoric from Trump. He said that conflict was unlikely, that the war wouldn't break out. And he also said that Xi spent a lot of time talking about Taiwan, that, Xi expressed that his position on Taiwan, that Taiwan's part of China, but that he didn't respond and that he didn't give his position away, which is what we expect from the US. They don't usually express their exact position on Taiwan. But what was a departure was that he specifically talked about weapon sales from the US to Taiwan. And he said that he would determine whether the next batch of weapon sales to Taiwan, I think he said it in the near future. Now, this is a departure. The US doesn't usually talk about weapon sales to Taiwan with Beijing. In fact, the US decades ago made an assurance to Taiwan that it wouldn't discuss that. So that's a departure. And there was another interesting thing that he said, that he suggested that he would have to talk to the person that's running Taiwan. Well, that person would be Taiwan's president, Lai Ching-te, and that would also be kind of a quite abnormal move. The president of the US doesn't directly speak to the president of Taiwan.
Benjamin, this visit took place as the U.S. is still bogged down in its war with Iran. That situation has not been resolved. Did Trump get any commitment from his Chinese counterpart to help open the Strait of Hormuz and end the war with Iran on terms favorable to Washington?
So as part of the press releases that the White House sent out following this meeting, they said that both leaders agreed that the Strait of Hormuz should be open. We expect that this was one of the main topics that they discussed behind closed doors. We know that China is really close to Iran, a close ally. Also, they have strong economic ties when it comes to oil. But many analysts here in the U.S. said that without having reached an agreement, a peace agreement with Iran before President Trump had to China, that put him in a weaker position to use the U.S. leverage there. So we can expect that there were some talks also on the military side, because Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth joined President Trump here. That's very unusual, too, for the U.S.
And Rick, how is Trump's visit to China being seen by people in Taiwan? Because there's been a lot of political debate within Taiwan about how it should calibrate its relations with China in particular.
Yeah, well, that threat from China has existed for decades, obviously, but so has that implicit backing from the US. So people in Taiwan have been watching very closely and have been watching Trump, since he's taken office the second term. People know the character of Trump as the deal maker that speaks off the cuff, and they've been, really worried about a couple of things during this trip. That one, Trump might change the US's official language on Taiwan. At the moment, it just says that it does not support Taiwan independence, but not that it opposes Taiwan independence. And also those weapon sales, which we have seen. We have seen Trump commenting on the way back to Washington there. And that's something that Taiwan's foreign minister has pushed back quite strongly on. He's been saying that any unilateral declarations by China cannot change the fact that Taiwan is a sovereign and independent and democratic country. He's been reiterating that it is China that is disrupting the peace and stability in the region, that Taiwan is a force for good. And he's also committed that Taiwan will continue to build relations with the US and other countries in the region and around the world.
Benjamin, from an American perspective, has this visit really changed anything in U.S.-China relations? Or, as you said earlier, is it really just the optics that Trump was going for this time?
Some analysts here in the U.S. say that this meeting actually happened after it was postponed is actually an success in itself. Also, that President Trump invited President Xi Jinping to the White House in September, probably also having more members of big Chinese companies who could also join them here. That's something that many people were looking at very closely, having Tim Cook there, having Elon Musk, having the CEO of NVIDIA that joined pretty on a short notice on Air Force One, and where they're also in conversation. So we can expect more of disagreements, and also what will happen with Boeing. There were some reports that China would announce buying a huge number of Boeing jets. That has not yet been confirmed. But that this meeting in September is actually happening is seen as a success. And going back to what you were talking there about Taiwan, when it comes to weapons sale, when it comes to the U.S. stance on Taiwan, many are wondering if it would be wise by the White House, by the State Department, to make any bigger announcement ahead of this visit in September when Xi Jinping will be here in Washington.
And Rick, from Taiwan's point of view, any important signals coming out of this that could change the calculus in relations with either the U.S. or China?
Well, Taiwan will be watching carefully what happens next. As I mentioned, the US has a policy of what's called strategic ambiguity on Taiwan, which it never really declares what its exact policy is towards coming to Taiwan's aid in the event of direct action from China. So it's quite often that the president might say one thing, or somebody from the administration might say one thing, and then that is then clarified by the State Department. We saw that with previously with President Biden, who would often personally say that, yes, he would come to Taiwan's aid, and then the State Department would have to say that, no, our policy has not has not changed. But Taiwan often says that they watch what the US does rather than what it says. So they will be looking at that $14 billion weapons package that is, sitting ready for Donald Trump to sign, pretty much. And that, that's really how Taiwan will know where it stands when it comes to Donald Trump. But like many countries in the region, everyone does know what they're dealing with, and that you can't guarantee, you can't rely on the support of the US in the same way. So like other countries in the region, Japan and South Korea, Taiwan is spending a lot more on defense. And Taiwan is also, similar to Japan, not just wanting to buy weapons from the US, but also kind of build up its own domestic weapons industry. Taiwan is building a lot of boats and is developing sophisticated weaponry such as drones and air missiles and that sort of thing.
Rick Glauert in Taipei and Benjamin Alvarez Gruber in Washington. Thank you very much. Well, Taiwan is an extremely sensitive topic in relations between the U.S. and China. Beijing strongly objected to Washington's latest arms package announced for Taiwan. Well, earlier I asked Bonnie Glaser, the director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund, if it's becoming more difficult for Washington to maintain its doctrine of strategic ambiguity as China becomes more powerful.
Well, I think we've heard from different presidents their positions on strategic ambiguity, and President Trump seems to have returned to a more traditional stance of not saying whether or not he would defend Taiwan if China were to attack it. It is interesting that Xi Jinping, in his conversations with Trump, actually asked him explicitly whether he would defend Taiwan. And President Trump held to his position, which he has stated previously, that that's not something that he would answer. So he says he is the only one who can determine, given the circumstances, of course, whether or not he would defend Taiwan, and he will not give that position. He will not answer the question or make a commitment in advance. And I do not think that he will depart from that position during his presidency.
Talk to us, Bonnie, about what Donald Trump was hoping to achieve with this visit versus what came out of the visit. Trump wanted to do business deals clearly with China and get Beijing's help in opening the Strait of Hormuz, ending the Iran war on terms favorable to the U.S. How far did he get with all that?
Well, on the issue of purchases of American goods, we have not heard much of concrete commitments made by the Chinese. On Air Force One, President Trump told the press that China has committed to buy 200 Boeing aircraft, but that after that they will likely purchase as many as 750. So we really don't know, because we haven't heard from the Chinese or from Boeing. There wasn't much discussion, I think, between the two presidents about agricultural sales, but we know that our Treasury Secretary had met in South Korea with his Chinese counterpart before the summit, and the U.S. claims that the sales of soy and beef and other agricultural products are going to take place. There was also discussion about possible Chinese purchases of U.S. energy, but we don't know. So this is really not clear. On Iran, things are a little bit clearer. At least the U.S. claims that the Chinese stated that the Strait of Hormuz should remain open, that no toll should be charged by Tehran, and that Iran should not be able to have a nuclear weapon. President Trump also claims that Xi Jinping committed to him that China will not sell arms to Iran. And in the past, the Chinese have sold particularly dual-use components and chemicals that have gone into Iran's military capability. So we don't know yet whether or not the Chinese made that commitment. But those look like, at least in the two areas that President Trump was interested in making progress. We'll have to see what the follow-through is after the summit.
Well, as you say, there are still quite a few question marks about what actually transpired between the two leaders. The two sides have offered rather different readouts on what was actually discussed and agreed upon. What do you make of that disparity?
Well, I think it's not surprising that the different readouts reflect the differing priorities of the two leaders and the two countries. The United States, of course, attaching importance to trade and Iran, and also fentanyl, which was discussed between the two leaders, and China attaching importance to the bilateral relationship and Taiwan. And on the bilateral relationship, Xi Jinping claimed that he and Trump agreed on a new vision for the relationship, which he dubbed a relationship of constructive strategic stability. I think this is aimed at locking in a truce that is relatively favorable to China and extending it as long as possible, even beyond the Trump administration. So going forward, the Chinese will likely refer to this understanding as the new Beijing consensus. And if the United States implements measures that are unfavorable to China, such as arms sales to Taiwan or tighten controls on technology, for example, China will accuse the United States of violating this new Beijing consensus between the two leaders. So this is something to watch going forward. The President Trump did not refer to an agreement on constructive strategic stability, and the United States has not defined what this means.
Well, constructive strategic stability sounds promising, but a lot of people are wondering, well, could this just blow up again the next time that Trump has a whim or decides to impose trade restrictions again in huge numbers? I mean, I'm just wondering, given that China has an ability to restrict American access to critical minerals that it needs so badly, and the rest of the world as well, could we still see a bumpy ride ahead during Trump's presidency in relations between the U.S. and China?
Absolutely, Terry. I think that neither the United States nor China wants a confrontation or a great deal of friction in the relationship. They both want stability for their own reasons, and particularly for Xi Jinping, who is headed toward a party Congress next year in which he seeks to get a fourth term in office. And he has a lot of personnel arrangements and challenges in the Chinese economy. So I do think that there is a potential for a spike in friction, differences over perhaps the tariff level. The U.S. and China have not yet extended the truce that was reached at Busan. And if the United States were to try to hike tariffs again, I think that China would again weaponize its dominance in the rare earth and critical minerals supply chain and try to prevent the delivery of the critical minerals and magnets that U.S. companies need. This is something that Trump very much wants to avoid. It is a priority for him. But as the United States continues to take actions against China and Chinese companies, if the United States perhaps misjudges what could provoke a strong response from China, then yes, we could be back to where we were at the beginning of the Trump administration in 2025.
Bonnie, thank you very much. That was Bonnie Glaser, Director of the Asia Program, German Marshall Fund.